America's federal budget is always a hot topic in election years. How can Democrats build a budget that closes the deficit, implements badly needed reforms to Social Security and Medicare, and also wins politically? PPI's Vice President Ben Ritz and PPI policy analyst Laura Duffy are both part of the Center for Funding America's Future, and they join the show to talk about their proposed federal budget from the Center for Funding America's Future. We discuss how their budget proposals would fix America's runaway spending problem, how they would shift to a more rational tax system, how they would fund important new programs without breaking the bank, and how to build a budget that focuses on what can be, unburdened by what has been. As always, if you enjoy the podcast and you want to leave us a like, if you want to subscribe, if you want to leave a comment, all of that is always appreciated. If you really enjoy the podcast and you want to support our work, please consider becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. You get access to bonus episodes of the podcast. You become a member of a local chapter, get involved in your community, get access to our exclusive Slack just for members. All of that can be yours. Become a member today at cnliberalism.org. And thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm Jeremiah Johnson, and today I'm joined by PPI's Ben Ritz and Laura Duffy. Ben and Laura, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
So, we are here today to talk about the budget. It's the most exciting thing in politics is, going line by line through the federal budget and deciding what we should spend money on and what we should not. This is what every, policy nerd dreams of. PPI has released a new budget called Paying for Progress, a pragmatic blueprint for the budget. I'm sure it's actually longer than that, but, it's got a very think tanky title. But it's actually a very interesting, exciting document, if you like this kind of stuff, that has a lot of really cool ideas for frankly, how we fix the budget. Before we get into kind of the actual meat and bones of the policy stuff, from just a high level, why does the budget need fixing? We're talking to an audience. Some of them may be, deep nerds on this stuff already. Some of them may, be aware of the problem, but not know a lot about it. So from a high level, what's wrong with the budget and why do we need change?
So I think there's a great quote from President Biden that really encapsulates why this is an issue. And that's, don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. The budget is not just a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a reflection of our values as a society. And we expect our government to tax us, take some money we all put into the common pot, and then they use that money to provide services. And right now, there's a big imbalance between what we're putting in and what we're taking out. There is an increasing amount of the budget that is on autopilot before, so the money is allocated before members of Congress even get in. And that's crowding out our ability to make critical investments in the future, and it's limiting our ability to address problems as they arise. And so this is a big issue, and we wanted to put out a comprehensive solution for tackling the myriad of problems facing the budget.
It's funny, Ben, you've come on the podcast to talk about the budget many times before. And I think back to, some of our very first conversations took place in a very different environment than this, when interest rates were low. And it kind of seemed like, well, there's no downside to deficit spending. We can just spend as much as we want. And you and I back then kind of talked about the downsides of if we just spend too much money, what's actually going to happen. We talked about it in a very theoretical sense back then. But I think we've seen the downsides recently that, we spent a ton of money on COVID relief. And you can argue that obviously we needed to spend some money because COVID threatened us with a real depression scenario. But we've seen the downside now. We've seen higher inflation than we've seen since, the 80s and in 40 years. And so, inflation is one of those downsides, certainly among many, that actually has come to bite us because we haven't taken care of this problem yet. Um, so it's just interesting to kind of see where we are now in order to kind of fix the budget, match the what's going into the pot and what's going out of the pot. You've got to do one of two things, right? You've got to either increase the money coming in or you've got to decrease the money going out. What approach does PPI's budget take in kind of a broad sense? Are we doing both? Are we trying to focus on one over the other?
The way I would frame our budget is we're reorienting it from subsidizing present consumption to making investments in the future. If you look at our spending levels, for the most part, our non-interest spending is only a little bit different than our current trajectory, but we are reducing spending on sort of paying for past promises. We do a dramatic reduction in the cost of interest because through tax increases and spending reforms, we get down the cost of interest that really is consuming resources we could be using for the future. And we reorient more that spending towards the future, towards future investments, and then we raise revenue to help pay for that stuff.
This conversation also comes at a really, really interesting time. We're recording this for everybody listening. We're recording this on Monday, July 22nd. And just yesterday, literally, I think we're still within 24 hours. So less than 24 hours ago, Joe Biden has decided that he's not going to run for president. He's handing off the reins to Kamala Harris, and it certainly seems like Kamala Harris is going to be the presumptive nominee. And I think this gives the Democratic Party a really interesting chance. Like, it's a really interesting political opportunity to reorient ourselves. Kamala Harris really could go in just about any direction she wants. She's got an amazing opportunity to kind of reframe the party, reframe herself, and think about what the priorities of the Democratic Party should be. So I guess as a political question, when you think about, what the priorities of the Democratic Party should be, both in terms of being able to win elections and being kind of fiscally responsible for the future, how do you guys think about that as a political question of like, how should the Democratic Party, which is kind of who we're communicating here to with this budget, how should the Democratic Party be thinking about this challenge?
So, as the party that believes that government can do good things, we have an obligation to prove to voters that it can do that right. Voters aren't going to trust the government with more of their money. They're not going to trust the government to do more things if they don't think the government can pay for the promises that it's already making. And so we saw this as part of what undid President Biden's push for the Build Back Better agenda. We've seen it in polling voters in polls that PPI has done of the working class, the swing voters in those pivotal states that showed that they're very frustrated with our handling of inflation, and they blame our spending policies for contributing to it. And so by showing that we can be fiscally responsible with tax dollars, that we can be focused in spending and making government work the way it needs to, and that we can keep the promises that we're making, that helps us make a better argument to voters that we're the ones who should be trusted with the reins of our public budgets.
One of the things that Kamala Harris could seize upon is investing more in training young people to prepare for the workforce, and also investing more in science and infrastructure so that those things actually lead to long-term growth and create a better future for children.
Love hearing about that. I mean, we've had Taylor Magg, who's one of your PPI colleagues, on the podcast, and absolutely love her work in terms of, training America's workforce. Not everybody goes to college, but we need, pathways to good jobs for people who don't go to college. R&D seems like a good idea. Obviously, there's so many ideas in here. And like I said, I think it's a real opportunity just for Democrats to kind of reframe this, that we are the party of fiscal responsibility. Because frankly, look, it's the GOP used to be the party of fiscal responsibility, but they've gone off the rails. They don't even pretend to try to balance budgets anymore. They are not doing anything to address this. So there's a real opportunity, at least from the way I see it. I don't know. Ben, do you see that kind of how do you see the Republican proposals? Is there even a shred of fiscal responsibility left there?
No, absolutely not. I actually had a column in Forbes about this last week. The RNC platform called for massive new tax cuts, particularly in the form of getting rid of income taxes and replacing them with tariffs that were not only more regressive, but also raised a fraction of the revenue. So they're cutting revenue and they're increasing spending. Trump has promised not to touch the biggest programs in the federal budget, Social Security and Medicare. Republicans have proposed massive defense spending increases. And if you actually take the Republican proposals put together, they not only have more deficits than what President Biden has proposed, they have just more spending than what President Biden has proposed. So it's really a budget busting inflationary agenda they're pushing. And for the first time in decades, their platform doesn't even mention trying to tackle the national debt. So I do think there's a real opportunity here if Vice President Harris wanted to seize it.
It's the classic politician's budget, right? We're going to balance the budget and we're going to cut your taxes and we're going to spend more money. We're going to do all three at the same time. Except at this point, I guess they're not even saying the balance the budget part. They're just, it's wish casting. But I do want to dive into some of the specifics here, because it's very nice at a high level to say, we're going to rationalize this. We're going to make it so that the system actually makes sense. We're going to prove to you that when you pay your taxes, it actually goes to something useful. We're going to be responsible stewards. All this is very nice to say at a high level, but it doesn't matter if you don't have the details worked out. And I know you guys have spent a long time working on the details. So I think we should start with kind of what's coming in. What's actually coming in as revenue to the federal government. One of the most interesting things I found in this budget is kind of you would call it a shift away from taxes that penalize work into consumption taxes. Can you explain, for people who are not tax policy wonks, what are consumption taxes and why are they better than taxes that, as you say, penalize work? What does that mean?
So currently, one of the biggest taxes for most Americans is the payroll tax, which is split between taxing your wages and your employer paying an equally sized portion of the tax of you just being hired and existing on the payroll. And that was established to fund our programs like Social Security and Medicare and create a link between the tax that you're paying and the benefit that you get coming out of that. But over time, it's been expanded to be about 15% on most people's wages. And it ends up both discouraging people from working and also discouraging companies from hiring people, because that same tax does not apply to other types of expenditures like on capital. So that is like one of our biggest taxes on work for most Americans right now. And what we would like to do is repeal that payroll tax and in its place adopt a value-added tax, which is a tax on the incremental value that is produced by you manufacturing a good in the economy. You sell it for some price, and there is like basically a sales tax added to that. And then ultimately, that value added tax is paid by the person who purchases the good. And so if we shift away from taxing people's work towards taxing the goods that they're consuming, then that means that you're not putting taxes on their savings, and they're able to invest that into the stock market, grow the economy, and build wealth for later uses. And so that's one of the biggest reforms that we would make to the tax code, to shift away from work and more towards taxing consumption. And the other one would be to enact a carbon tax, which both, achieving our goals of addressing the climate crisis in a really cost-effective way, but then also raising revenue that we don't have to raise from other activities like working.
I mean, like the basic economic logic here, right, is that when you tax something, anything, you're probably going to get less of it. People will do less of the thing that you taxed. If you tax, buying apples, people will buy fewer apples because they're more expensive. If you tax, going on vacation, people will take fewer vacations. And if you tax work, if you tax labor, people end up working less. And I think there's pretty sound economic theory and proof behind that, right? And so we're trying to shift the burden that taxes place away from productive work and onto things like, the consumption goods, or even better, as you said, carbon taxes, which is, carbon is a negative in our atmosphere. So if we get less of that, that's actually a bonus. That's basically the logic here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Ben, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, and I think just one other really important point here is there's a progressivity angle. When you tax, I think there are people who think that if you tax consumption, it's more regressive than the payroll tax because lower income people spend a higher proportion of their income than richer people, and that just makes sense. You're able to save more if you have more money. But previous research we've done and others have done have shown that it's more distributionally neutral over your lifetime. It's actually more an issue of younger and older people spending more and middle-aged people saving more. And it really does kind of even out over the long term. But the other issue is the payroll tax is capped. You only pay that 15% on the first $170,000-ish of your wages. And beyond that, you get a massive tax break relative to lower earning people. The benefit of a consumption tax is if you're a high income person and you're spending all this money on yachts and mansions and et cetera, then we're getting tax revenue from that. And so it actually can be a more progressive system.
The progressivity, or just the amount of progressive nature of the tax system is always a hot topic, right? There's always an element of like, well, who should pay? There's rich people, there's middle class people, there's poor people, and if we're increasing or decreasing taxes or changing the tax system, there's a lot of that complaint of like who's going to end up paying, and of course it's always popular to just say, well, the rich people should pay for all of it, and certainly rich people should pay their fair share. They should be paying more than poor people who can barely afford it. But I do think that's an interesting angle to look at, especially with other items like there's one of the sections that you guys have in here is that we desperately need to make the tax code simpler. Especially as it applies to like individuals. So how would that apply? Do those two ideas intersect at all in terms of making the tax code progressive? And how progressive should it be is an open question. And then also making it simpler at the same time. Do those kind of ideas go hand in hand to you, or are they totally separate?
Yes, I definitely think there's a huge link between tax systems being simple and progressive. So one of the most egregious items in our tax code right now is the deduction for state and local taxes. That just allows
some listeners may have heard of this as the SALT tax, right? That's what it's commonly known as.
The SALT deduction, yeah.
Yeah, the SALT deduction, not the SALT tax, but it's the SALT deduction. And what kind of person typically gets the SALT deduction?
It typically is people who have high incomes who don't take the standard deduction, but they end up itemizing their taxes because they live in states that have high property taxes or high income taxes, and they're paying a whole lot in taxes at that state and local level. And then they get to deduct that amount that they paid from their federal tax liability. And it ends up being that like the vast majority of the value of this tax expenditure is captured by the top couple of percent of people. So if we could repeal this, then we would make the tax code a lot simpler for people and more progressive. The downside, or so a lot of people would say, is that there's a reason why we have this, and that it's so that state and local governments can raise money in a progressive way without fearing their most high-income people from leaving the state to go to more low-tax areas. And we just figure that instead of doing this indirect subsidy to state and local governments, what we can do is repeal the SALT deduction, make a more progressive federal tax code, and then use some of those savings to just create block grants that we can give to state and local governments so that they can, spend on infrastructure and public education without having to be subsidized by having lower federal taxes on their high-income residents.
Well, one of the things that strikes me here is just, our tax code is enormously complicated. And you've given like one example here, the SALT deduction, which just says, like you said, that you can kind of deduct your state and local taxes from your federal taxes, and it ends up benefiting mostly very wealthy people. But when you've got a system that is so complicated, you're going to end up with all these little carve-outs, right? You're going to end up with all these little exceptions and all these little complicated systems and complicated schemes, and most of those are not going to be for the benefit of working class people, right? They're going to be for the benefit of somebody who owns a very specific type of expensive asset, or somebody who owns an expensive home, or who makes a lot of income. Like it seems to me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot of these kind of, as you call them, tax expenditures, these loopholes, some other people might call them, they're mostly for the benefit of people who are already doing very well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the main reasons that tax complexity benefits higher earners is because if you're taking the standard deduction, as Laura was saying, you just take that deduction and you move on. If you're itemizing your deductions, that means you're really getting to take advantage of that tax complexity. And itemized deductions benefit high earners for two reasons. The first is the value of a deduction is greater if you're in a higher tax bracket. So if each dollar you deduct from your taxes, and that means you're making your taxable income smaller, was taxed at a 40% rate, you're saving 40 cents on the dollar. If you're in the 15% bracket, you're only saving 15 cents on the dollar. Then even more importantly is high income people just take the standard deduction a lot more than lower income people. In 2023, more than 70% of households with incomes over $1 million itemized their deductions, whereas less than 3% of households with incomes below 100,000 did. So it's just really overwhelmingly the primary beneficiaries of all these complicated tax credits and deductions, they're high earners.
All right. So one of the things that has been talked about really, really frequently on the Democratic side of politics is Joe Biden's pledge to not raise taxes on anybody who makes under $400,000 a year. And that's, it's a little bit funny to define rich as making $400,000 a year, because that seems like a very small slice of the workforce. I don't have the statistics offhand. You might, but it seems like that would be like less than 5% of America makes that much a year, I'm guessing. And I get that you have to
half that.
I understand that you have to you go where the money is. If you need to raise revenue, you've got to go where the money is. And that's why people have this instinct to go after rich people. Like we need more tax revenue. We want to do more things. Therefore, we tax the rich. But to what extent does this actually make sense? And how does your budget treat that $400,000 line? Is that a line we should respect? Should we have a different line? Or should kind of the tax policy be more broad-based? How do you guys approach this?
No, it is not a line we should keep. And if I was going to pick one thing that I wish Kamala Harris would do differently than Joe Biden, I would just move away from that pledge entirely. As you said, it's a very small percentage of people. It's about 2% of people. But the pledge not only limits the number of people you can tax, it also limits what share of their income you can tax. Because if you're making $500,000, then 80% of your income is functionally off the table to the tax. And it's even worse than that, because President Biden's pledge said if you're making no household making under 400,000 will pay any more money, any more money in taxes. And so a change that raised 99% of the revenue from over 400,000 and 1% of its revenue from $350,000 households, you couldn't do that under the pledge. So, and furthermore, we think that to what we're talking about at the top of the show, if we want to make the case for government programs, if people want to support government spending, they have to be willing to contribute to it. If you only want a government program if someone else is paying for it, it doesn't really have a democratic mandate. So both because we think it's important from a values perspective and just the math, you could not pay for the Biden administration's proposed spending levels and keep the $400,000 pledge. We don't try to adhere to it at all. We make the tax code more progressive. We have a lot of tax increases on high earners in here. We have a new tax bracket for households making over $1 million and households making over $10 million. We have a very progressive inheritance tax proposal, so that we're taxing unearned income for folks who get their wealth just because they were born lucky, instead of taxing their work or their investments. So we make the tax code more progressive, but we don't try to say only the rich will pay for everything and you don't have to do anything, because it's not economically feasible and we don't think it makes for good government.
All right. So I want to pivot away from kind of what's coming into the pot, and let's talk about what's going out of the pot. Let's actually talk about government spending programs, because this budget, as you said, tries to kind of rationalize things and to some extent balance the budget to get it, where we don't have as much of a deficit through both directions. We're trying to raise revenue and we're trying to, where we can, cut government spending. I want to talk about, there's a lot of really cool ideas you guys have for actually really, really good programs on stuff people are going to love, whether it's housing, whether it's trade, immigration is part of this budget. All of these things really, really actually matter to the budget. But one of the big things we have to get out of the way first is entitlement reform. There's a great kind of graphic in this budget, right in the introduction, that says, look, back in the 50s or 60s or whatever, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, automatic spending in the form of Medicare and Social Security and so forth, and like interest payments or whatever, the stuff you had to do automatically was only like 25% of the budget, I want to say. And now it dominates the budget. Now Social Security and Medicare and these kind of automatic things are like 2/3 of the budget, potentially even more. And so there's no way to actually really get a long-term sustainable budget without really tackling some of these big items of like, what are our interest payments going to be? What is Social Security doing? What is Medicare doing? So I want to talk about all the fun stuff, but to be responsible, we've actually got to talk about the hard stuff first. So, and then I promise we'll get to the fun stuff. But how does this budget attempt to kind of control the spending that we're going to need to control, frankly, for Social Security and Medicare? Because Social Security, it seems to me like it's one of those things where we can have the conversation now, or we can have the conversation in 10 years when the money's run out. And either way, it's a hard conversation. We might as well go ahead and start having it today, right?
Sure. So I guess I'll take the unpleasant stuff, and then I'll let Laura lead more on the fun stuff. So yeah, Social Security and Medicare, they're the biggest programs in the federal budget. They're almost half of non-interest spending, just the two of them together. And they're also the fastest growing programs. So we really have to get that under control if we're going to get our budget in a good picture. The alternative path of just raising taxes to pay for current promises, we kind of reject that approach for a couple of reasons. The first is we think it's not good economic policy, but also it's not intergenerationally fair. Social Security's been under collecting revenue for many years now. And not enough money was put in to pay for the benefits coming out. And if you're just doing all the deficit reduction on the tax side, you're taxing younger workers and making them pay for the entirety of an imbalance that was created by older generations that didn't pay their own fair share. And so we propose a balanced approach that would roughly be the equivalent of fixing half of the problem with tax changes and half with spending changes. And something that I think is really unique about our approach to Social Security is we thread a needle between making the program more progressive, but still maintaining that earned benefit structure that is critical to the political popularity of the program. So what do I mean by that? Right now, Social Security benefits are based on how much you earn. You replace an average of your lifetime earning. And it's a progressive replacement rate, so you get a little more if you get a higher percentage of your wages replaced if you're lower income than higher income. But wealthier people who've had higher incomes throughout their lives, get larger benefits. So we're spending a lot of money on the older Americans who need it the least. There've been proposals to flatten the benefit structure, give everybody the same benefit, but there's been a concern that breaks the relationship between I earned this benefit that progressives believe is why people think of Social Security different than welfare programs. Our approach is to say, okay, we're going to keep it as an earned benefit, but we're going to base the benefit accrual on how many years you worked rather than how much you earned. So if you have put in a lifetime of hard work and contributed to the program, you're going to get a higher benefit than somebody who works fewer years and makes less of a contribution. But we're not going to give you a greater benefit just because you were a higher earner. And so we end up with a formula that is more progressive, but it's also lower cost. If we take our package together, and that's not the only change we make changes to the retirement ages and higher benefits for vulnerable beneficiaries like widowers and people who are older and likely to have outlived their savings. But our plan would actually reduce poverty for older Americans, for people over the age of 70, by 10% relative to the current benefit schedule, and an even greater 40% relative to a scenario in which we do nothing and the Social Security Trust Fund is projected to exhaust. Because under current law, if we do nothing, when previous surpluses are exhausted and spending continues to outpace revenue, benefits are reduced across the board to the level payable by incoming revenue. And so our plan, by being fiscally sustainable, we prevent that benefit cut, and that reduces old age poverty while also reducing costs.
And I think that's the real key here, right? Is look, if we do nothing, I've seen quoted a couple numbers. So sometimes it's like 20% cut across the board. Sometimes it's 25% cut across the board. But if we do nothing, everybody's benefits are getting cut. And so instead, maybe it makes sense to go ahead and try some reforms now where we do, and honestly, I was kind of impressed that this doesn't seem like a radical change. It seems like, you push the retirement age up a little bit slowly. You increase taxes just a little bit. You make it slightly more progressive. You change the structure, like you said, from like how much did you make to how many years did you go. And like none of these are like by themselves like crazy huge changes, but just 5 or 6 little nudges in the right direction. And you can actually blunt the impact, I think, of that 25% cut that we're going to have otherwise,
Yeah, I think one way a good way to think about our Social Security changes is if you're low income, our changes will actually give you a higher benefit than the current schedule, if slightly higher. If you're high income, on average, there's some differential based on how long you worked, but on average, we're letting you absorb the impact of the cut. We're saying we're not going to ask working families to bail out high earning Social Security beneficiaries from what they didn't pay for. That cut's going to go into effect. And then it's like a graduated scale in between then. And so we're softening the impact for lower and middle earners, but we're not doing a bailout of high earning beneficiaries.
And then the other big thing here, I think, is Medicare, and we could spend a whole podcast talking about healthcare policy in America and health spending, and we don't really have time to get into the huge nitty gritty. But I will ask, just at a high level, before we get into the more fun stuff, what kind of healthcare policy changes and healthcare spending changes are we advocating for here to just try to control and get healthcare costs under control for the federal government?
So there are two policies in here on healthcare that I want to talk about specifically. The first is our proposal to go after high prices. Because in the US, the reason our healthcare costs are so high isn't necessarily because we have older populations or we're overutilizing healthcare. We just have higher prices because our system's so inefficient. And that's particularly true of how we price things. There's not a lot of price transparency. If a doctor's in network, they're taking a very different rate. They're charging a different rate to the insurer than they would if they're out of network, or if you're seeing costs when you're uninsured, or if you're trying to get services when you're uninsured. So under our plan, we would actually cap the amount that can be charged for out-of-network services, starting at twice the rate Medicare pays, and then ratcheting that down a little bit over time. And the effect of this is twofold. Number one, it's taking some of those highest possible opaque prices, and it's making it so you're not getting charged 4 or 5 times what Medicare is paying when you see a doctor. But it's also encouraging providers and insurers to negotiate better reimbursement structures between them, because the cap doesn't apply to in-network rates. It's promoting managed care. So instead of trying to pay for each service provided that promotes more utilization, it's trying to promote better outcomes. And it's promoting price transparency, because you can't charge a higher rate unless you've had those negotiations ahead of time. So that's our main broad healthcare cost control. There's a number of other policies in there, but that's the biggest one. And then our changes to Medicare. Medicare's situation is actually much worse than Social Security's, because first off, it's a very disjointed structure. You have 3 parts of Medicare, parts A, B, and D, that cover hospital services, physician services, and prescription drug benefits. They all have different co-pays and premiums and deductibles and reimbursement rates, and we say, let's simplify it. If you instead of going into traditional Medicare, you do a Medicare Advantage plan. You're getting a privately provided Medicare plan. You get one plan that covers all your benefits, just like the insurance you get through your job right now. So we say, let's make traditional Medicare more like that. Let's consolidate the different parts of Medicare into a Medicare One benefit. You can choose between Medicare One or a Medicare Advantage plan that works for you, as you kind of do under the current system. And there's one copay, one deductible, one premium, and it's just a simpler system. And then we would set the subsidy rate for your health insurance. So the share of your Medicare One or Medicare Advantage premium, we set that base that the federal government pays. We set that based on the average bid of all of these plans. So so that encourages competition. It encourages you to go for the lower cost plans. It encourages the plans to compete against each other for lower costs, and that'll help bring down healthcare prices. In fact, the CBO looked at this option a few years ago and concluded that it would both reduce the cost of healthcare for the government and reduce costs to beneficiaries. So it's really a win-win system that we have here.
It's funny. I have so many questions that I would love to ask here, but healthcare is such a rabbit hole. I think we're going to have to save that for a future podcast. Especially because, look, we've been taking our medicine up to this point. We've been talking about how, we've got to fix the deficit if we don't want inflation to go crazy, if we don't want interest rates and interest payments to go crazy. We've got to fix the deficit. We've been talking about how to get more revenue, the smartest ways to raise taxes. We've been talking about cutting entitlement programs or reforming them, however you want to say it. We've been taking our medicine, but now I want to talk about the stuff that we can actually get excited about. And nobody wants to run politically on a message of, I'm going to cut your benefits and raise your taxes. We want to run on the exciting new programs that we believe are going to help people. And so I guess I'll just toss this out. I have lots of things I want to ask about, but Laura, I know you've worked on several of these. What are some of the things that you're most excited about in the budget? What can Democrats be excited about in this budget? What can new liberals get excited about in here that you think could really be positive for America and for, that would really help people?
Expanding the child tax credit is one of the first and of many policies that we have to make a more family-friendly budget at the federal level. One of our recommendations is that we have a paid family leave program at the federal level that would replace some percentage of people's earnings so that they can go start a family without having to choose between that and paying the bills. And once that paid family leave is over, a lot of families are really stuck right now with really high childcare expenses. So part of our child tax credit proposal would be for to increase the amount to $5,000 from $2,000 if you have kids who are under 3 years old, so that you can have a little bit of flexibility. Maybe you spend that on paying those childcare expenses. Maybe you stay home a little bit more and you take care of your kids from home. That just gives some flexibility for those early years to be able to address whatever the family's needs are. And then we also would like to see the federal government step up and support states to enact universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds. That would both serve as a place for kids to go that's safe, where they can learn things, really get a head start on their education, but also allow parents to be able to be in the workforce and be able to support their family financially while still having a good environment for their kids to go. And then, and so those are some of our early childhood policies that we would like to see. One of the really visionary things, I think, in the budget is a proposal for child opportunity accounts, which are somewhat similar to baby bonds, which maybe some people have heard of. But it's we open up these accounts that are savings accounts that the government will deposit money into if you're from a low-income family, and then it phases out if you're from a high-income family. And so each year there's an amount of money that is placed into those accounts, and that leverages like compounding interest, and so that amount of money snowballs. And so at the time a kid turns 18, maybe goes to college, maybe wants to go into a trade profession, get a car, to be able to commute to their job, something like that, that they have this this money that's in the bank that they can use to invest in their future and get ahead. So that kids who are from lower income backgrounds aren't put at any disadvantages relative to kids who maybe had much more financial opportunities growing up. And we would also like to see, as part of this, like, it really be integrated into the education system so that everybody has this account, they can learn about financial readiness in school, and that there is just much more preparation for everybody to be able to become financially literate and successful in their life.
And I should just clarify, the annual government contributions are based on income, but we actually envision this being a universal account. So that everybody starts out with something, and it's just there's more if you're from a low income background, to really give people, as they're going through the education system, that universal experience, that experiential learning opportunity for how to save and build wealth.
I think this collection of programs is really fantastic, and it's something I think we can get excited about as Democrats, as new liberals. And I kind of make this case several ways. I think there's just kind of a rationalist economic kind of case for, like, the programs, the poverty reduction programs that you aim at small children are actually super, super effective. We know the child tax credit was really, really effective at reducing child poverty. Universal pre-K has a really good track record. It has proven benefits, like research shows this. And I think they're just some of the most economically effective, rational programs to promote. But you can also look at it from like a moral standpoint, like, if you want to think about the morality of poverty, no child has certainly ever deserved to be in poverty. You could maybe extend that, say no person ever, but like especially like no 4-year-old has ever deserved to skip a meal. They've never done anything that would have caused that to happen. So I think there's a special moral responsibility there for children. And I just think it's a fantastic part of the budget.
Yeah, and I just want to add one last thing there is we also have in addition to all the great policies Laura outlined, we also have a big expansion of the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, that would help low-income families supplement their wages, and it would really allow low-wage parents to have an after-tax income that's sufficient to support their family. So between that and the child tax credit expansion, the ways we're benefiting lower income families more than offsets any additional tax they would pay from like the VAT or the carbon tax, and it's a much more progressive system.
Now, because this is the New Liberal podcast, I am contractually obligated to mention a few other things that I've seen in this budget that get me personally excited. I know the budget talks about tariff policy and trade. I know the budget talks about our immigration system. Look, the immigration is not purely a budget issue, but the amount of immigrants we have does impact the budget. And then I know it also talks about housing. And these are all issues, again, if they come up in the budget, I will be, tarred and feathered by this crowd if I don't mention them. So what in these kind of 3 areas, I'll let you tackle whichever one you want to first, but housing, immigration, trade are like some of New Liberals' core policies. It's the stuff that these nerds who are listening care about the most. What can you tell me about what this budget plan has in those areas?
Sure. So I'll talk about immigration for a bit and then kick the other two over to Laura. So because I think immigration, actually really fits well with the previous conversation we were talking about with the family policy and Social Security and Medicare, because these programs, the reason they're in such bad financial situations is because the ratio of workers to retirees is going down. The number of people we have paying taxes relative to the number of people taking benefits out is getting worse, and that means each worker has to cover the benefits of more people. And if we have more workers, if we have more young people, that helps the finances of these programs. Contrary to what Donald Trump said in that presidential debate, immigrants are not hurting Social Security. They're actually helping Social Security. We've seen in CBO report after report, all these economic analyses, they pay more into the programs than they take out in benefits. And so, we see a smarter immigration system as being a key part of fixing our demographic problems, in addition to supporting family policy and some of the entitlement reforms. Getting more people contributing is just as important a part of that system.
I also think that Democrats have a pretty big opportunity to win on a message of trade, and especially in terms of lowering costs for people. Tariffs are a pretty big tax on people's everyday consumption goods, and they're also extremely regressive. So our colleague Ed Gresser has done a lot of really good work on how the tariff system puts higher rates of tariffs on goods that lower income people tend to buy. So if you buy a steel spoon, it's taxed at a much higher rate than a silver spoon, or a polyester sweater is taxed much higher than a cashmere sweater. And so like these types of taxes that people pay just disproportionately hit low income people. And Democrats, I think, should actually run on this. And because Trump wants to put a 10% tariff on everything, and a 60% tariff on goods coming in from China, that's going to hurt a lot of families. They're going to pay thousands of dollars more in taxes on average. So we would like to see the tariff system be reformed so that we reduce tariffs overall on things like the steel tariffs that Trump put in place, but then also across the board for some of these goods that people buy every day, like clothes or food.
Yeah, especially just look like politically, what's going on with the Trump tariffs, where it's insane the level of tariffs and kind of the economic worldview that Donald Trump has, where like trade is this zero sum thing, right? Where there's winners and losers, and we just got to put huge tariffs on the other side, and so then we'll be the winners and they'll be the losers, and it's kind of it's a fundamentally like insane worldview that we haven't had for like 150 years or some god awful amount of time. But it's at its core, Donald Trump wants to make your life more expensive. He wants to make virtually everything you buy and pay for more expensive. And like if Democrats can run on that message and contrast it with a message of like, we want things you buy to be less expensive. We're going to get rid of these taxes, and make them fairer. And like that, to me, that seems like a winning message. And, the one of the frustrations I've had with Joe Biden, who overall has been a wonderful president and has accomplished a lot. But, one of the frustrations I have is that he also kind of seems protectionist at times. And I would view this as a opportunity for Democrats to pivot into a free trade message. I don't know. I mean, you guys are the budget experts, and I don't know if you have political views on this, but I think there's a real upside there.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a really good political opportunity here for Democrats. While Donald Trump and Republicans have all these proposals to increase costs by cutting public investments, increasing the deficit and inflation, raising taxes on goods that are disproportionately purchased by lower and middle income people. We're presenting a plan that cuts those taxes, that cuts taxes on their work, that instead raises revenue from high earners and taxing investments and consumption to really try to lower costs rather than increasing them. And so I think there is really a good opportunity here for Democrats if they want to seize it as being the party of cutting costs and boosting growth rather than ceding that to the Republicans.
And then finally, before we get out of here, because we're coming up on time soon, but before we get out of here, I want to talk about housing. Obviously, housing is an enormous economic issue. We've talked about housing so many times on this podcast, and I think everybody who listens kind of understands the case for why housing costs are out of control, why we need to build more housing. The basic logic of that is pretty sound. I think the real question is, for this podcast, how can we impact the housing market in America with the federal budget? What are the tools that we have that we can actually use to either help us build more housing or to make it more affordable while we build more housing? What kind of programs do you guys have dreamed up here where we can actually use the might of the federal government to help what is often a very local or state issue?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things that I would like to mention. The first one is even though zoning is a local and state thing, the federal government can use its power to spend to try to incentivize states to change their policies and preempt local zoning codes. So we would create a race to the top zoning grant that rewards states that do actually change their zoning policies and build more housing with some financial incentives that they could use for housing issues in their states. And then another thing on the tax side that is worth mentioning is that we would like to see the federal tax system move towards full expensing. So that means that if you make a, say, $10 million investment, say you build a structure, you're investing in multifamily housing, that $10 million currently has to be spread out over more than 2 decades over your future taxes. So 27 years from now, you will still be deducting the expenditures that you're making today. And the issue with that is that, well, in 27 years, inflation has eroded the value of that tax deduction. And also, if we have opportunity costs, so you would actually just more value having that deduction today instead of 27 years from now. So what we would do is allow you to be able to deduct the full cost of building multifamily housing or any other type of capital investment or research and development in the year that it's made, so that you will be more incentivized to make those investments right now and build more housing, create more abundance and growth.
And just one other point I want to make on that is that we're in our current environment when the Federal Reserve has had to raise interest rates to combat inflation. That's created a big problem for housing construction because as interest rates have gone up, as businesses have to borrow the money to cover the cost of this construction while they wait to get those deductions in the future, that's made housing construction more expensive. And so a benefit of full expensing is we reduce the dependence on debt and we reduce the impact of these higher interest rates that are designed to slow consumption. We reduce how much they slow investment. And so this is really a pro-investment policy agenda that we're offering here that will help expand housing supply as well. And that will, of course, cut costs, as everybody who listens to your podcast knows.
There's this real negative feedback loop with the interest rate thing you mentioned, Ben, where like, look, inflation is too high. And so the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates. And so that leads to less construction of new housing because it's more expensive. That's by design to some extent. Like higher interest rates, like you said, are meant to lower consumption. It's meant to like stop us spending as much money. But if we build less housing, then rents go up. And, that's a dynamic that we've seen in this country where we stop building housing and rents go up. And rents are a huge amount of what people are experiencing as inflation in their real lives. People with higher rents, higher cost of living. And it's almost like it feeds back into itself that the high interest rates kind of cause less construction, rents go up, inflation stays high. Like all of this is part of the same cycle. So anything we can do to break out of that is really, really valuable. I'm going to encourage, we're going to link the budget here in notes. And look, guys, I know it's a tough sell to tell somebody, the podcast listener, you should really go read this, 150-page budget. But at least I'm telling you, it's a really, really good budget. There's so much that we haven't even gotten into, in terms of reforming the debt limit and automatic stabilizers. There's really important sections on fiscal democracy. There's talk about descheduling marijuana and taxing it as another way to raise, some amount of income. There's talks about IRS enforcement. We didn't even get into SNAP and TANF and agriculture subsidies. And, there's cost of college stuff. There's really so much good policy in here. There's so much stuff I haven't even had the time to mention. If you're interested in this kind of wonky stuff, if you really care about policy, you should definitely go check it out. And it's a very long document, but it also does have very readable summaries of each section, where you can just get the cliff notes if you want. So that will be in the show notes. And any other final thoughts here, Ben and Laura, for people who might be interested in learning more about what all the different things you're proposing here?
So one thing I want to say about this document, we don't expect anybody. I can count on one hand the number of people who don't work at PPI who are going to read this thing front to back. I think of it really more of a sort of a reference book of policy ideas. At the top of it, there is a very digestible summary of recommendations that covers the kind of comprehensive vision we're offering in this blueprint. And then if there are areas that you're specifically interested in, if you want to learn more about our housing policy, you can go to that section and learn more about it. And so I think it's meant to be kind of a broad overview, and then you can dive into the specifics as you're interested in. I don't want anybody to get turned off by it just because they think they have to read the whole 160 some pages, because I promise you do not.
All right. Well, I certainly appreciate the work you guys have put into this. I think it's a really fantastic vision for where America could be headed, in terms of just It's responsible. It does what we need to do. It takes the medicine that we need because, frankly, we've been spending beyond our means, right? But it also has stuff to get excited in there. It's not just, the pain, the medicine, the responsibility. There's also a lot of really creative new ideas. There's creative policy that can really help people that I think we can get excited about, that we can run on politically. And so I just want to say thank you guys one more time for making this. Thank you for coming on the show, Ben and Laura.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jeremiah.